Imagine for a moment that you've spent 40 years of your life in a state of war. You've made enemies that you thought would be your enemies until the day you died. You've lost friends to bullets fired from those enemies' guns. You've seen neighborhoods torn apart by the violence between your organization and theirs. You've lived with the constant weight of knowing that any moment could be your last. And then imagine that on Christmas Eve, one of your greatest enemies calls you and offers you something you thought was impossible, peace. But sometimes, the sweetest offer contains the bitterest poison. The phone rang in the back office of the social club on 116th Street just after 2 in the afternoon on December 24, 1964. Outside, Harlem was covered in a thin layer of fresh snow. The city had that particular quiet that comes only on Christmas Eve, when the normal chaos of the streets settles into something almost peaceful. But inside the office, surrounded by heavy wood furniture and the smell of expensive cigars, there was no peace. There was only tension. Bumpy Johnson was sitting at his desk, reviewing ledgers. His fingers, thick and powerful, traced down columns of numbers. Money, always money. The numbers were good, better than they'd been in years, actually. The trade was flowing smoothly. The dealers were moving product faster than they could restock it. The protection rackets were bringing in steady cash from the shopkeepers and business owners who paid for the privilege of operating in Bumpy's territory. Everything was working like a well-oiled machine, but there was still something gnawing at him, something that all the money in the world couldn't fix. It was the war. The endless, exhausting war with Vincent Gigante that had been going on for nearly a decade. Men dying, territory being fought over block by block, police raids increasing, the tension on the streets growing thicker every month. It was costing him money, sure, but it was also costing him something more valuable than money. It was costing him peace of mind. One of his men, a tall guy named Marcus, who served as the secretary of sorts for Bumpy's office, stuck his head in the door. Marcus looked uncomfortable, which immediately put Bumpy on alert. Marcus was a steady guy. He didn't get uncomfortable about much. "Boss, you got a call," Marcus said. It's Gigante." Bumpy looked up from the ledgers slowly, his eyes, dark and intelligent, fixed on Marcus with an intensity that made the younger man take a step back. Gigante didn't call. Gigante never called. Their entire relationship was conducted through intermediaries, through the subtle language of violence and territorial disputes. A direct phone call was so unusual that Bumpy's first instinct was to assume it was a trick of some kind. An assassination attempt disguised as a conversation, a setup. "You sure?" Bumpy asked, his voice even and controlled. "Yeah, boss, definitely him. I recognize his voice. He says he needs to talk to you, says it's important, says it's about business." Bumpy set down his pen carefully. He gestured for Marcus to leave the office and close the door. Marcus did so quickly, clearly relieved to be away from the tension. Bumpy sat in silence for a long moment, staring at the telephone on his desk. The phone continued to ring, insistent and demanding. Bumpy had built his empire on caution. He had survived this long in a business where men died regularly, where the average lifespan of a crime boss was measured in years rather than decades, because he thought before he acted. He considered consequences. He anticipated moves several steps ahead of his opposition. He was careful, but he was also pragmatic. And pragmatism told him that ignoring a phone call from Vincent Gigante might be the biggest mistake he could make. If Gigante was calling, there was a reason. If Gigante wanted to kill him, the phone call was an odd way to do it. More likely, Gigante wanted something. More likely, this was something that needed to be addressed. Bumpy picked up the phone. He didn't say anything. He just breathed, letting the silence on the line make clear that he was there and listening. Johnson, the voice on the other end, was smooth, controlled, and carried the faint accent of an Italian brought up in the streets of New York. "Vincent Gigante, I appreciate you taking my call. Didn't have much choice," Bumpy said flatly. "You tell someone I'm expecting a call. They put it through. What do you want, Gigante?" There was a pause on the line. In that pause, Bumpy tried to read what was coming. He tried to anticipate the trap that he was certain was being set, but there was something in the pause that felt different. It felt like hesitation. It felt like a man gathering his courage to say something that he wasn't sure how to say. When Gigante spoke again, his voice had changed slightly. It was softer. It sounded almost vulnerable, which was shocking coming from a man who had built his reputation on being ruthless and cold, on being willing to do whatever needed to be done to maintain power and territory. "I want to make you an offer," Gigante said. I want to propose something that I think benefits both of us. I want to make peace. Bumpy felt his entire body go still. The words hung in the air between them like something physical, something that needed to be carefully examined and understood before a response could be formulated. Peace. Vincent Gigante was proposing peace. After nearly a decade of war, after hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on violence, after men on both sides lying in graves because of the conflict between these two organizations. Go on, Bumpy said carefully, giving nothing away in his voice. I'm tired, Gigante said. There was something genuine in the admission. I'm tired of this, Johnson. I'm tired of losing men. I'm tired of the police pressure. Every time there's a murder in Harlem, every time there's a shooting, every time there's violence on the streets, the cops come down on my organization like we're running a charity instead of a business. It's affecting my ability to operate efficiently, it's costing me money, it's costing me men, and I think it's costing you the same thing. Bumpy didn't respond immediately. This was the kind of moment that required careful thought, Gigante continued, filling the silence. I'm proposing a truce, formal, binding. Each of us gets control of specific neighborhoods. We respect each other's territories. We respect each other's operations. We stop the killing. We stop the bloodshed. We work together when it benefits us both. We become partners instead of enemies. What do you say, Johnson? Don't you think it's time we ended this thing? It was everything that Bumpy wanted to hear. It was the solution to a problem that had consumed him for years. The possibility of peace was seductive. It was almost hypnotic. But Bumpy was not a man who allowed himself to be seduced by words. He had survived this long by being suspicious, by being careful. Why should I trust you? Bumpy asked. It was the obvious question, but it needed to be asked. You shouldn't, Gigante said, and the honesty of the answer actually surprised Bumpy. Not based on words. Words are cheap, but I'm willing to prove it to you. Tomorrow night, Christmas night, I want to meet with you. Just the two of us. No guards in the room. Just you and me. At Minato's restaurant on 116th Street, we'll sit down like civilized men. We'll have a meal. We'll talk about the specifics of the agreement. We'll shake hands like two businessmen making a deal. And if after that meeting you don't believe that I'm sincere about the peace, then everything goes back to the way it was. But I think after we meet face to face, you'll understand that I'm serious about this. It was a bold proposal. Meeting one-on-one with a rival crime boss, in a public restaurant no less, was the kind of thing that had gotten plenty of men killed over the years. It was the kind of invitation that made every survival instinct Bumpy possessed scream in protest. It was dangerous. It was reckless. It was the kind of thing that a smart gangster simply did not do. But there was also something that Bumpy couldn't ignore. There was something in Gigante's voice that sounded genuine. There was something that sounded like real exhaustion. There was something that sounded like a man who had genuinely grown tired of the game he was playing and wanted out. I need to think about this, Bumpy said. Of course, Gigante replied. But don't think too long. Christmas only comes once a year. Johnson, and I think this year, Christmas could be the day that everything changes for both of us. Everything could get better. Everything could be different. All we have to do is be willing to meet each other halfway. The line went dead. Gigante had hung up. Bumpy sat in his office for a long time after that call ended. He sat in the silence and darkness of the room, with only the desk lamp casting shadows across the ledgers in front of him. Outside he could hear the sounds of Harlem on Christmas Eve, people talking, a radio playing somewhere, a car horn in the distance, the normal sounds of the city. But inside the office, there was only the sound of Bumpy's own breathing and the sound of his mind working through the problem that had just been presented to him. He called for Marcus and the other men in the social club. They gathered in the office, the key members of his organization. There was James, one of his oldest lieutenants, a man who had been with him for 15 years. There was David, who handled the northern operations. There was Robert, who managed the drug distribution network. There was Tommy, who coordinated the protection rackets. These were Bumpy's closest advisors. These were the men he trusted most. He told them about the phone call. He told them about Gigante's proposal. He told them about the invitation to Minato's restaurant on Christmas night. And he watched their faces as he spoke, reading their reactions like pages in a book. James was the first to speak. It's a trap. Boss has to be. Gigante doesn't just call you up and offer peace. That's not how the game works. He's trying to get you isolated. He's trying to set you up for something. I agree, Robert said. Every instinct I have says this is bad. This screams setup. But David was quieter. David was thoughtful. David said, maybe it is a trap. But what if it isn't? What if Gigante really is tired? What if he really is ready to make peace? If we pass this up and it was genuine, we're making a huge mistake. We're extending the war indefinitely. And if we take the bait and it is a trap, then Bumpy ends up dead, Tommy said sharply. That's the risk we're taking. That's what we're gambling with. The men argued back and forth. The debate went on for hours. Christmas Eve turned into Christmas night, and still they were debating whether Bumpy should meet with Gigante. Some were adamantly opposed. Others thought it might be worth the risk. Bumpy listened to all of them, but he made his own decision in his mind early on. He was going to meet Gigante. He was going to listen to what the man had to say. He was going to take the risk. The reasoning was simple. Bumpy had spent his entire life fighting. He had spent his entire life assuming that every gesture of peace was a trap. He had spent his entire life looking over his shoulder. And it had made him successful, sure, but it had also made him exhausted. If he turned down this opportunity because of fear, he would be allowing his fear to control him. And Bumpy Johnson did not allow fear to control him. Fear was a tool that he used, but it did not control him. I'm going, Bumpy said finally. I'll go to Monato's tomorrow night. But I'm not going blind. James, I want you to position men around the restaurant. David, I want you to have people watching the rooftop and the fire escapes. Tommy, I want you to have men in the kitchen and watching the back entrance. Robert, I want you stationed outside with a car running, ready for an immediate extraction if things go bad. If anything looks wrong, if anything feels off, I want you to move in and pull me out of there. Understood. The men nodded. They didn't like it, but they understood. They began making preparations immediately. The network was mobilized. Word went out to various corners of Harlem. Men who trusted Bumpy, who had worked for him for years, who would die for him, began moving into position around Monato's restaurant. Christmas morning came bright and cold. Bumpy stayed home with his wife, Margaret. Margaret was a strong woman, a woman who had learned long ago not to ask too many questions about Bumpy's business. She knew what he did, she knew who he was, but she had also learned that the less she knew about the specific details, the better she could sleep at night. On Christmas morning, Bumpy told her that he had a meeting that evening. Margaret looked at him carefully, and in her eyes, Bumpy saw something that he rarely saw. He saw fear. She was afraid for him. She didn't know what the meeting was about, but she could sense that it was important. She could sense that it was dangerous. Come back to me, she said simply. Whatever this is, wherever you're going, whatever you're doing, come back to me. I will, Bumpy said. And he meant it. He pulled her close and held her for a long moment. That evening, as darkness fell over Harlem, Bumpy dressed carefully. He put on a suit that was expensive but not ostentatious. He wanted to project confidence, but he didn't want to project arrogance. He carried a pistol under his jacket, hidden where no one would notice unless they were looking for it. He had knives strategically placed on his body. He had learned long ago that it was always good to have multiple options for defense. At 8:30, he left his apartment and made his way to Monato's restaurant. He drove himself, with Robert following at a distance in a separate car. The streets of Harlem were quiet on Christmas night. Most people were at home with their families, enjoying the holiday. The neighborhood had a peaceful quality that Bumpy rarely saw anymore. When Bumpy arrived at Monato's, he saw that Gigante's men were already positioned around the building. There was a man standing outside the front door, trying to look casual, but clearly there for security purposes. There was a man visible in a parked car across the street. There was evidence of activity on the rooftop. Gigante had taken the same precautions that Bumpy had. He had prepared for trouble just as thoroughly. Bumpy sat in his car for a moment, hands on the steering wheel, taking a deep breath. This was it. This was the moment where he was either about to start a new chapter in his life, or where he was about to walk into an assassination. There was no way to know which. There was only the choice to move forward or to turn back. Bumpy turned back. He got out of the car. He walked slowly toward the restaurant entrance. The man who was standing outside moved aside to let him pass. No words were exchanged. Bumpy pushed through the door into the warmth of the restaurant. Monato's was an upscale Italian restaurant, the kind of place where the waiters wore white gloves and the tables had white tablecloths. It was not crowded. There were maybe 5 or 6 other tables occupied, mostly with people who looked like they were there for Christmas dinner with their families. The restaurant smelled like garlic and tomato sauce and red wine. Vincent Gigante was sitting at a table in the back corner of the restaurant. He was sitting with his back to the wall, a position that allowed him to see the entire restaurant and everyone in it. It was the position that any experienced criminal always chose when sitting in a public place. When he saw Bumpy, he stood up slowly. Gigante was a smaller man than Bumpy, but he carried himself with the kind of confidence that came from years of running an organization. He was dressed similarly to Bumpy, in an expensive suit, dark and well-tailored. He looked older than Bumpy remembered him, more tired. The years of running a criminal enterprise had aged him. His face was lined. His hair had more gray in it than Bumpy recalled. They made eye contact across the distance between them, and for a moment, neither man moved. It was a moment of assessment. It was a moment where two men who had been enemies, who had sent other men to kill each other, who had been locked in a war that had consumed both their organizations, stood and looked at each other directly for perhaps the first time in years. Gigante reached out his hand. It was an open gesture, a gesture of peace, a gesture of vulnerability. Bumpy walked forward slowly and shook Gigante's hand. It was a firm handshake, the handshake of two men who respected each other's strength. And then Bumpy sat down at the table across from Gigante. "Thank you for coming," Gigante said. "I wasn't certain you would. I wasn't certain I should," Bumpy replied. "But I'm here." Gigante gestured to the waiter, who appeared immediately with a bottle of wine. They ordered food. They sat in relative silence for a moment, neither man quite sure how to begin the conversation that they needed to have. It was Gigante who started. He began by talking about the war. He talked about how it had started years ago, when he had first tried to move into territory that Bumpy controlled. He talked about the escalation, the violence, the men who had died. He talked about the cost of it, not just in money, but in time and energy and mental exhaustion. He talked about waking up in the morning and knowing that somewhere in Harlem, one of his men might be dead by nightfall. He talked about the police pressure that came with being involved in a gang war. He talked about the way the war had made every other aspect of his business more difficult. "We're bleeding money," Gigante said plainly. "Both of us. We're spending enormous resources on a war that neither of us can win. I can't defeat you completely, Johnson. You can't defeat me completely. We're locked in a stalemate. And the longer the stalemate lasts, the more it costs us both." Bumpy listened carefully. As Gigante spoke, the waiter brought their food. Expensive cuts of meat prepared carefully. Wine that probably cost more than most Harlem residents made in a month. They ate slowly. Between sentences, the conversation interrupted only by the need to chew and swallow. "So, what are you proposing exactly?" Bumpy asked. "Give me the details." Gigante pulled out a piece of paper from his jacket pocket. It was folded carefully, and when he unfolded it, Bumpy could see that it contained a map of Harlem. Certain areas had been outlined in different colors: red for Bumpy's territory, blue for Gigante's territory, green for neutral territory, where both organizations could operate. "I get the south side," Gigante said, pointing to the area below 110th Street. "You keep the central and northern areas. There's a buffer zone here, and here, where we have joint operations and we split the profits 50-50. The drug trade, the numbers game, the protection rackets, all of it gets divided according to this map. We don't encroach on each other's territory. We don't send men into each other's neighborhoods without explicit permission. We communicate regularly so that we're not surprised by anything the other person is doing. And most importantly, we stop the killing." It made sense. It was logical. It was the kind of arrangement that actually benefited both sides. It was the kind of agreement that would allow both organizations to function more efficiently while reducing the risk to everyone involved. "And what happens if someone violates the agreement?" Bumpy asked. He was thinking like a businessman now, like a man making a deal. He was thinking about what happened if one of the parties broke the contract. "Then we address it directly," Gigante said. "You and me. No hidden agendas, no surprises. Just two men talking to each other and working it out. If it's a simple violation, a matter of a dealer crossing into the wrong territory by mistake, then we handle it quietly and move on. If it's something more serious, something that represents a genuine threat to the agreement, then we discuss it and decide together what the consequences should be." They talked for hours. They went through the proposal point by point. They discussed contingencies. They discussed how they would communicate. They discussed how often they would meet to discuss ongoing operations and any problems that arose. They discussed what would happen if either organization was approached by a third party looking to take advantage of the peace between them. And as they talked, something remarkable happened. The animosity that had defined their relationship for nearly a decade began to soften. They found themselves actually enjoying the conversation. Gigante told stories about his early years, about how he had clawed his way up from nothing to become a powerful crime boss. Bumpy shared memories of the streets of Harlem, of the way things had been when he was starting out. Gigante told a story about a time when he had been arrested and spent 6 months in jail. Bumpy talked about his own time in prison, about the men he had met there, about the way that experience had shaped him. They laughed. They made dark jokes about the business they were in. They drank wine and ate expensive food, and found that they actually respected each other in a way that only two men who had spent years in conflict with each other could understand. The restaurant had emptied out. The other customers had paid their bills and left, going home to their families, their Christmas celebrations finished. The restaurant staff was cleaning up, preparing to close. The waiters began stacking chairs on tables. Bumpy realized that it was late. He realized that they had been talking for nearly 5 hours. And in those 5 hours, they had done more than just negotiate a peace treaty. They had found common ground. They had found a mutual understanding. Gigante pulled out another piece of paper. This one was a formal agreement. It was written in careful legal language. It outlined everything they had discussed. It defined the territories. It defined the terms. It outlined the dispute resolution process. It was a document that had clearly been prepared in advance, which meant that Gigante had been serious about this from the beginning. He had been planning this peace proposal for a while. Bumpy read through the agreement carefully. It was fair. It was balanced. It was the kind of agreement that a lawyer would have approved, but neither man was interested in involving lawyers. This was a matter of honor and trust between two men. This was a matter of their word. "I need to make a change," Bumpy said, pointing to one of the paragraphs. "This section here about the neutral territory, I want it expanded to include the area around the hospital. That's where a lot of people from both our neighborhoods go when they're sick or hurt. I don't want either one of us running operations in or around the hospital. That's sacred ground." Gigante looked at where Bumpy was pointing. He read the section carefully. Then he pulled out a pen and made the change himself, crossing out the old language and writing in new language that reflected Bumpy's request. It was a small change, but it was significant. It showed that Gigante was willing to adapt the agreement based on Bumpy's input. It showed that he was serious about making this work. When the agreement was modified to both men's satisfaction, Bumpy pulled out a pen of his own. He signed at the bottom of the document. Then he slid it across the table to Gigante, who signed as well. They sat in silence for a moment, looking at the signed document between them. And then, almost simultaneously, they both stood up. Gigante came around the table and embraced Bumpy. It was a genuine embrace, not a formal gesture. When they pulled apart, Gigante looked Bumpy directly in the eye. "Merry Christmas, Johnson," he said. "I think we've just made ourselves very rich and very powerful by ending this war. And more than that, I think we've just saved a lot of lives." "Merry Christmas to you too," Bumpy replied, and he meant it completely. When Bumpy left Minato's restaurant that night, he felt lighter than he had in years. The weight that had been pressing down on him, the constant vigilance, the knowledge that men were dying because of the war between him and Gigante, all of that seemed to have lifted. He had been given a gift on Christmas night. He had been given peace. He got in his car and drove through the quiet streets of Harlem. Robert followed at a distance, as planned. Bumpy thought about calling his wife. He thought about what he would tell her. He thought about how he would explain that the meeting had gone well, that there was peace now, that things were going to change. He thought about what this would mean for his organization. The war had been expensive. The war had been dangerous. The war had limited his ability to expand his operations and increase his profits. With the war over, with the territories clearly divided, with a formal agreement in place, everything would be different. He could focus on making money instead of making war. He could focus on building rather than destroying. For 3 days after the meeting at Minato's, Bumpy was euphoric. He made calls to his organization, informing them that the war with Gigante was over. He told them about the territorial agreement. He told them about the plan to divide the neutral territories and work together rather than against each other. The men in his organization were shocked, but mostly relieved. The war had been hard on everyone. Peace was welcome. But on the evening of December 27th, 3 days after the Christmas meeting, one of Bumpy's men came to him with information that would change everything. The man's name was James, one of Bumpy's oldest lieutenants, a man who had been with him for 15 years. James looked troubled when he asked to speak to Bumpy privately. The two men went into Bumpy's office and closed the door. "Boss, I got to tell you something," James said, his voice low. "And I don't know how you're going to take it, but you need to know. I got word from someone I trust on Gigante's side, someone who was there that night." "There for what?" Bumpy asked, though he thought he knew what was coming. "There for the job? Boss Gigante set a trap for you at that restaurant. He had men positioned on the roof. He had men positioned in the kitchen. He had a plan to take you out that night while you were sitting at the table. It was supposed to be an execution disguised as a peace negotiation." Bumpy felt the room tilt slightly. He sat down in his chair heavily. He had been right to be suspicious. He had been right to be cautious. The meeting had been a trap. He had walked directly into an ambush. "Go on," Bumpy said, his voice still controlled, even though his mind was racing. James continued, "But something happened. From what I'm hearing, there was disagreement within Gigante's organization about the plan. Some of his men didn't want to do it. They thought it was dishonorable. They thought it violated something sacred about a face-to-face meeting between men of honor. They were arguing against it right up until you showed up. And Gigante, he was having second thoughts too. By the time you were actually sitting at the table with him, he had decided to call off the hit. He told his men to stand down. He told them it wasn't going to happen." "How do you know this?" Bumpy asked. "Because two of Gigante's men who were supposed to be part of the hit came to me. They know that you and I have a history. They wanted to warn you. They wanted you to know what almost happened. They wanted you to understand that the peace offer might have started out as a trap, but somewhere along the way, it became real. Somewhere during those hours you spent talking with Gigante, something changed his mind. He decided to honor the peace instead of executing the plan." Bumpy sat in silence for a long time. He tried to process what he had just been told. He had been inches away from death. If Gigante's men hadn't objected to the plan, if Gigante himself hadn't had a crisis of conscience, Bumpy would have been assassinated on Christmas night while sitting in a restaurant offering peace. But there was something else that Bumpy was beginning to understand. There was something profound in what had happened. Gigante had set a trap, but then he had walked away from it. Gigante had prepared to murder Bumpy, but then he had decided not to. In the midst of a trap, Gigante had found humanity. In the midst of violence, he had found peace. "Did you talk to him?" Bumpy asked. "Did you ask him why he called it off?" "No," James said. "But from what I'm hearing, he just changed his mind. He said that once he started talking to you, once he realized that you were just a man like him, tired and worn down by the same things that were wearing him down, he couldn't go through with it. He said that killing you wouldn't solve anything. He said that it would just start the war up again, maybe worse. He said that maybe the better choice, the smarter choice, the more powerful choice, was to actually make peace." Bumpy stood up and walked to the window of his office. Outside, Harlem was going about its business. People were walking on the streets. Cars were driving by. Life was continuing in the way that it always did, indifferent to the dramas that played out in the criminal underworld. "Thank you for telling me," Bumpy said finally. "And thank those men on Gigante's side who came to you. They showed honor. They showed that they understood something important." "Boss, what are you going to do?" James asked. "We could retaliate. We could strike back. We could..." "No," Bumpy interrupted. "We're not going to do anything. The peace still stands. Gigante intended to kill me, yes, but he chose not to. He chose to honor the agreement instead. That's worth something. That's worth more than something, actually, that's worth building on." In the weeks that followed, Bumpy and Gigante continued their relationship as partners. They implemented the territorial agreement they had negotiated at Minatos. They worked together on matters that benefited both organizations. They maintained their peace. They both became richer and more powerful because of it. The violence in Harlem decreased dramatically. The police pressure eased. The neighborhoods became safer. On Christmas Eve 1964, Bumpy Johnson walked into what was meant to be an assassination trap set by Vincent Gigante at Minato's restaurant. Instead of violence, something unexpected happened during their meeting. Gigante chose to step back from murder. Despite his careful plans, he decided to see Bumpy as a human being worthy of respect, rather than an enemy to eliminate. Bumpy never revealed this truth to anyone outside his inner circle. Though various legends about that night circulated through Harlem's underworld, some claimed he'd brought extra men, Others said a priest intervened, and some denied it ever happened. But the real story was far more profound. During their hours together, something shifted. Gigante's choice to pursue peace instead of war had cascading effects that touched countless lives. Families were spared violence, men lived full lives instead of dying on the streets, and Harlem itself transformed. The deeper lesson was that true power lies not in destroying enemies, but in recognizing shared humanity and changing course. Gigante gave Bumpy something invaluable that night. Proof that genuine human connection and understanding could penetrate even the darkest worlds of crime and violence, turning a planned assassination into a negotiation and an ending into a new beginning.